Good evening, Urban Edge, and welcome to our COVID hack chats. We are going to be just talking a little bit about emotional health. I know that in this time of COVID lockdown and with the pandemic happening, there's a lot of emotion that we're experiencing at the moment, and we just want to have a little chat about it. Tonight we're going to be having a look at stress and coping, just so that we can really dive into emotions and give you some helpful information to be able to manage and cope with it. Part of the reason why I feel like, and as a church, we're speaking about emotions and it's focusing on this area is because we are spirit, soul, and body. And we understand that our spirit comes alive and connects with Jesus when we accept Him as Lord and Savior. And our body is something we can always see, and so we can take care of it. But sometimes our soul, the emotional part of us, our minds, we don't see it, and sometimes we're unaware of what is happening in it. And so it can get neglected, or sometimes we don't understand it. And so we're going to be chatting a little bit about things to help us to navigate our soul life in this time. So my name is Genevieve. I am on the team at Urban Edge. I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm also an educational psychologist. And with me tonight is Mario, and he's going to tell you a little bit about himself.
Hi, Urban Edge. I'm Mario Smith. You would have seen me around at church. And I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I'm also involved in higher education. But mostly I don't manage to say no to Genevieve. So I'm here joining on this talk.
I didn't really force him into it, but kind of. Cool. So Mario, why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about maybe what is stress and what are some of the things that people are finding at this time with COVID?
Yeah, thanks, Genevieve. Well, stress is something that is actually quite normal. It is your body's response to the environment. And so if that's the case, then obviously there could be something called good stress and something called negative stress. So right now, I'm very stressed out because I'm trying to keep these earphones in and they keep falling out. And so that's my body responding to the environment. That's stress. And stress at optimal levels is actually called eustress. That's our word for the day. And that means that it's stress that actually keeps you performing. But when stress overwhelms you and it becomes too much, or it's too frequent, or it's not appropriate at the level for you to deal with, then it becomes distress. And that is quite useful. So God has created us in an amazing way, and our bodies have a natural rhythm in which we go through cycles, and the body actually repairs itself. So at night, for example, we sleep and we go into what's called deep sleep, and through that time, our body repairs, and it repairs all the impacts of stress on our body at various different levels, from the cellular level through to the overall composite experience. In the same way, we have something called the fight or flight response, and I'm sure everybody's heard of that. But again, that's one of the ways in which we were created. It's a way in which our body alternates between cycles of preparedness to respond to stress and cycles of rest and recovery. And when those periods of recovery are not enough or not frequent enough, then we become overwhelmed. So stress really is quite normal and natural. I would be very worried if you don't experience stress. But it's really about the amount of stress, the frequency of stress, and your capacity to manage it at a physical and emotional and spiritual level.
So it's kind of like a balancing act, really, between good stress and bad stress, being able to cope with stress and what life is kind of throwing at you.
Yeah, I think what we want is to ensure that stress is optimal, because that then means that we can perform well, whatever the performance is. So if I'm an athlete, then I prepare and I go into race mode, and that actually is a stressful situation, but I've prepared for it, and that stress makes me perform. But if we put some of the dads in the same races at the school sports, then that would be distress because we haven't prepared, we're not in shape, and that is would overwhelm us. So it's really about understanding what the environment is demanding from you and what available resources you have to manage or cope with that.
Okay. So if we have to kind of look at COVID at the moment, what do you think are some of the things that people are finding unprepared for, or that it's too much and overwhelming? Maybe an example or something.
Right. So COVID is quite interesting, right? It's something that we couldn't have anticipated, and it affects everybody. So it's what we call an acute stressor because it's happening right now and it's quite intense. And some of the things that people are stressed about is whether they'll get infected, whether the precautionary measures are enough, whether they are going to lose their jobs or their income, or whether their kids are ever going to go back to school. So there's a whole range of things. And I think the big challenge with COVID is twofold. One is that we are all personally vulnerable. And in worst case scenario, if you become ill, you could actually die. And the second level is that it completely changes your normal routine. So having a routine is quite useful and predictable and comfortable and manages our anxiety. But the unpredictability and the force implication of the lockdown and some of the travel restrictions it really plays a challenge pose a challenge for us, because we don't have choice. Our choices are taken away to some extent. Our ability to move around is taken away, and that becomes quite stressful.
So, like, I know in just going back and reading up a little bit more about stress for today, like there were just some areas, like we've spoken a lot of the external things that cause stress that are thrown at us, and obviously the good and the bad. The good being that it actually drives us forward as a challenge, it helps us grow. But like some of the things I think in stress, and I know for myself going through this period, there's been a lot of ups and downs with emotions. I've had some really good days. I've had just really bad days. I've had days where I'm like, yes, we're getting in a good routine and we're doing the homework thing and everyone's cooperating. And then like this week was a throw it all out the window, watch as much TV as you like, and I just can't deal with this. I need to be by myself in my room. And I think like there was just some words that sort of came out that I saw and something that even for myself, and maybe some questions to pose like to you guys that are watching. Stress can come as something that's harmful, something that really feels like it's attacking us. So like you said, COVID is an attack on us, on our bodies, on our health. A loss, the loss of a job, the loss of freedom to move around, the loss of your school and your friends, then obviously a challenge, which for some people is really difficult, but for others, they rise to the challenge. Like, this is exciting, finding a new way to win. How can we move business? How can we get this online platform thing going? And then obviously threat, which I think goes along with harm. Harm being something that's happened to you, but threat, something that could still come. And I think that threat of we don't know what's still coming is still there. And so I find myself often like, I need time to sit and find out what is it that's causing me the stress, if I had to put it into a category. And sometimes it's all of them at one go, but sometimes it is just, well, I've lost out on something. And right now, loss means I need to grieve that, or I've been hurt or harmed by something. That's painful. I need to recognize that. Like going through the emotions and stuff, how does that help us cope with stress?
So I think the first thing that's important is that we have to develop an understanding of what we can actually control. See, my things keep falling out. So we have to think about what we can actually control. And often what stresses us out the most is not COVID or the threat of becoming ill, but it's the fact that we can't control the outcome. We don't control whether lockdown is going to be extended. We don't control whether other people are in fact going to wear their masks or sanitize. We don't control what happens with the economy. And these things that are outside of our control actually is what causes a great amount of stress. And often people who tend to be warriors, they kind of worry about things, they obsess about the things that they are unable to control. So a really big consideration when you think about what is stressful in your life is what is actually under your control. And it's that sense of not being in control that becomes overwhelming. So if I think about Elijah, for example, he's one of the major prophets in the Old Testament. I mean, this man was so bold. He went up to the queen and told her, I don't like what you're doing. He was just bold, living out his prophetic life. So hint, hint, anybody would like to buy me a Christmas present, I need new earphones. So he's just amazing. But when there was the threat to his life, when she threatened to have him executed, he became so stressed to the point that he went from being incredibly powerful and in control to falling apart.
Yeah.
And that's actually the really great example. It's not so much about how well you were performing before you became stressed. It's the perceived loss of control and worrying about those things that you can't control. So with Elijah, we saw him worrying about whether he's going to die and whether he was going to be executed. Instead, what was in his control was doing God's will, living out the prophetic word, and looking after himself physically, spiritually, and emotionally. And so that, I think, is quite important in where the stressors become harmful. So the stressor, the event, actually isn't harmful in itself. In fact, what's quite radical is that the trigger of stress is neutral. So for example, COVID may not be stressful for me. It may be super stressful for you.
Yeah.
And the minute one or two people can interpret the stressor differently, we then refer to that as a neutral thing.
Wow.
So it's a bizarre idea for us. So for example, if I get robbed, how is that neutral? That's stressful.
Yes.
But some people will say, oh, that's the worst thing that can happen to me. Others will say, at least I'm alive, and I didn't provoke my attacker more. So it's really about the extent to which you are able to understand what is in your control. That determines the consequences and the outflow of that interaction that is stressful. And that's an important distinction for us to make.
Sure. I think, because often when I think about stress, it's what's happening to me. But actually a big part is what's happening inside of me, and taking the time to really deal with that. I love that you brought up Elijah. He's one of my favorite characters, and I love reading his story because it gives such hope that when you're in such a dark place that there is a space where you can come out of that. And I love in his story that God meets him in the place where he was at. God called him to the mountain and met with him. And it wasn't in the fire or in the earthquake or in the wind, but it was in that still, quiet voice. And I think that's just one of the things that I found has been really helpful during this time, is when there's so much noise from the outside in terms of the stresses and the information coming through media especially, and there's so much of a storm going on inside of me trying to manage the stress, to find that quiet place and that still place with God where he can actually speak into that and deal with the internal things. What is it that you think in terms of the external versus the internal can we deal with when it comes to stress?
So I think for both, it's quite important to look at what your process is of sense making, right, and how you understand things. So when we look at the external, those are often, the triggers are often external, but often they're internal. So I could have a memory that triggers stress, or I could be thinking about something and that could trigger stress. So when we look at external sources of stress, the amazing thing is that if I say to you right now, Genevieve, your Ricky's pet snake got out of the terrarium and is actually under your chair, what would you do?
I would probably freak out, stand on the bed and run away, and the show would be over.
Right. So we're all focusing on the word you used, right? You said you would freak out.
Mm.
But actually what you're doing is you're moving away from the threat. So with external threats, one of the really important things that we can do is move away, is gain distance. So when you're freaked out, and you're standing on top of the chair, you're moving away from the snake.
Mm.
So distance is quite useful. And when you're standing on the table, looking down at the snake, you will probably realize, oh, I could just move towards the door, or I could call animal control, or I could, or this snake is not a boa constrictor, it's not going to swallow me whole. But moving away gives you distance, and it helps you to really think differently, and to appraise the situation more appropriately.
Okay. All right. So
When,
if somebody's like at home and they're struggling with stress right now from
Mhm.
either loss of a job or trying to navigate their children through the school work or just
Right.
being very bored, the first thing is like try and find some distance from that, physically if possible, and even maybe like emotionally or mentally, just take a break from that scenario for a bit.
Absolutely. So you gave the example earlier of trying to get the kids to do schoolwork. And I'm going to make sure my kids don't listen right now. So, the expectation is that they work every day and that they get a certain amount of work done. But at some point that may become quite overwhelming for them and for you, because you're not actually their teacher. And this is not a normal, natural situation.
No.
So one of the ways of getting distance is then, having a day where you don't do as much work, or kind of having a down day, and not doing the work. So in that way, you can create distance. Some of us are fortunate and we have more spacious homes, and our kids have their own rooms, and so they can distance in that way. The other way we can get some distance is to use the social media platforms. Is to actually stop the one thing you're doing, watch a movie. One of the fantastic things that we've been doing as a family is watching the game drives, and we can post that a link for you, so you're able to virtually join a drive through one of the wild the game reserves.
Oh, wow.
And that's been amazing, and that's one way of creating distance.
Sure.
So it's finding those ways. My eldest daughter is an excellent writer, so she likes to write, and that's a way of gaining distance. I like gardening, so I go outside and I putter around, and not everything grows, but hey, that gives me distance. So it's finding those ways in which you can find distance. Of course, my boys, they just do PlayStation and YouTube videos, and that gives them distance. So it's allowing and identifying ways in which to find distance, but managing that. What we don't want is to be avoidant. And so there's a difference between distance and avoidance. What we want to do is to just create some space to release the pressure and to think again, as opposed to avoiding the stress or avoiding the situation, because then it actually just gets worse.
Sure, very good. And I think one of the things you said just now is, the distance, and helps you to appraise the situation, and then you can make steps from there on. And I think part of that appraisal process is obviously getting into that internal life and how we experience things. I think you said earlier, like stresses can be neutral because it might affect one but not another person. And that's very much because of what's going on inside of ourselves. Something like frustration of, I'm aiming towards something, but I'm not able to get it, or maybe even like this external pressure, like, you've got to be the perfect mom who can do all the chores, cook the dinner, still do your work, and get your kids educated. And that's sort of an internal pressure that we put on ourselves based on whatever we pick up on the outside world, or even just our own perfectionism even. And so I think also part of that is in bringing that. And I think what you mentioned earlier is that what can we control and what can't we control. And like Elijah, just going before God and like, I can't, I can't. But there's that part with maybe we can hand over to God what he can. And then in that space, appraise, okay, I've distanced. What can I do steps going forward now.
Right. So how do you eat the elephant? Step by step. It's breaking it down into smaller, manageable pieces. So, for example, in this current climate, it's about how do I remain safe? How do I minimize threat? How do I keep a routine going, etc. So it's breaking it down into small, manageable pieces rather than trying to solve the entire crisis before everyone wakes up tomorrow morning.
Sure. Very true. Very cool. Awesome. So I think in closing, if you had to say like just one thing that we could take home, or what, like one take home challenge with regards to dealing with stress, what would that be?
I would say that it's really important to know yourself. It's important to know what your baseline is and what your capacity is. So you need to know what would freak you out. When the snake's here by me, I would want to see what kind of snake is it? Is it poisonous? Can I Google it? Can I sort it all out? And then, oops, it's about to bite me. Let me move away. So it's important to know who you are, what your baseline is, and what your capacity is. So I'm going to say two additional things, Genevieve, if you allow me. So you need to know what triggers you, what your vulnerabilities are, and how you manage that. And then there are basic things, keep a routine, get enough sleep, get exercise, nutrition, kind of all the basic things that enable your body to be physiologically in a good, fit, healthy space, and that helps you to fight stress, but also keeping your emotional health in check. So making sure that you're able to manage challenges as they come along. And I'm thinking of when the spies crossed over into Canaan and they came back, 10 of them said, "Oh, we are dead. We are so dead." They just went into Fortnite and everyone's respawning and they're dead. But 2 said, "No, actually, we have a different perspective." And so what's interesting is when they move from that point where they assessed very differently, they did something that was very important. They counted the stones. And they actually looked back and they asked, where has God brought us through?
Wow.
What have we overcome? What have we achieved? And remembering all of those past victories, all of those past challenges, and how you've overcome it is really helpful, because that gives you hope of being successful again. And reminding you of the capacity that you have to overcome.
Wow. That's really cool. That's great advice. You see, that's why I chose you as the assistant. Cool stuff. So I think what's really great is you mentioned 2 other things, and I know we've got a couple of weeks of COVID hack chats coming up, and we are going to be talking about those 2 areas of looking after our emotions and putting things in place to help us navigate these things over the long run. So I'm really looking forward to chatting some more about those. But I think just next steps going forward, obviously taking what we've spoken about today, but also part of coping and dealing with stuff is to get connected and to have people share the load with you. And so I want to encourage you, if you're not already connected into a Connect group with Urban Edge, please get in contact with us. We have our WhatsApp line. Send a prayer request if you need us to pray with you and stand with you in the spirit, but also to help you get connected into a group where we can have people come around and help support you through this time, and then access your support structures that are already around you. But then also, if you're finding yourself really overwhelmed with emotion, or we're going to put some websites and contact details in there for if things are getting way too much for you to handle, and you need to seek help, a counseling line, or perhaps a health professional, speaking to your doctor who can then refer you to a health professional if things are getting to the point where you really can't handle it. But I really want to encourage you that if you have any further questions, we are running out of time, but if you do have any further questions, we're going to have a Zoom chat after this, and those details will be in the description on the videos, or under the videos, and so you can have a look there. And if you have questions that you want to send in for that chat, you're welcome to use the SMS number, the cell phone number that's there to text through a question, or join us on that Zoom chat so that you can hear the answers and get some more information. But Mario, thank you so much for your insight and for sharing with us today. I'm looking forward to implementing it and to managing this stressful time just a little bit better.
Thanks, Genevieve. Yeah, we are expected to grow through stress, and stress actually helps us to just grow. And it's really helpful to think of Luke 2, verse 52, which gives us the outline of how to grow. And it uses Jesus as an example. So Jesus grew in spirit, in favor with God and man, and in stature. So, we need to grow physically, and exercise, and look after our bodies. We need to grow socially and make use of the social connections. And we need to grow spiritually. And then, of course, we need to grow cognitively. We need to exercise our mind. And it's really important in terms of stress to manage the exposure to information about the COVID, because it can overwhelm us if it's too much and all the time. And also to discriminate or distinguish between fake information, fake news, and actual news. So find reliable sites that you can access.
Very good.
Thanks. And so we look forward to some questions from those who are watching.
Awesome stuff. See you there now.